So the second part of the lecture, what I want to talk about are classification trees. So classification trees, along with support vectors, are the two pillars of, let's say, the workhorse of industry. And so I want to give you an example of how to build a classification tree. Now, classification trees are very much similar to decision trees that you might have learned, like if statements, or you might say diagrams, that flow charts that you would say, is this true or not? And then you'd make a decision to the next level. Is this true or not? You make a decision to the next level. So the decision tree is going to set up in a very specific way. You're going to look at your data, and we're going to talk about how to chop this data, but you're going to have some kind of question. And the question is very simple. And there are generalizations of this, but typically the question is this true or false? So there's some question. So for instance, you could ask in your data, is the value of a certain parameter above 50? It's a yes or no question. It's very simple to answer. And you might say, well, if it is, if the answer is yes, then you come over here. You cluster some of the data over here. If no, you come over here. And the way the decision trees typically work, you would then start building on the no answers. Okay, well, if that's not true, what about this next question? Is this true? This would be another kind of prototypical question you might ask about another variable in your data. And typically these questions are intended to be asked exactly about your data. For instance, is one of the variables above 50? Yes or no? No? Okay. Now, is another variable greater than a certain amount or not? If yes, you stop. If no, you keep going on. And you just have this structure where you keep generating from a root. You keep generating branches and leaves. That's what they're called. So there's basically, that's the idea behind the classification trees. You're going to take this thing and you're going to start breaking it down into these constituent parts. Now, the question really comes is, what's the kind of question I should be asking? Right? What you would like to do is automate the system. The classification trees, or decision trees, classification and decision trees, they're actually called classification and regression trees, CART. Classification and regression trees, that's the standard thing that you might find out there in the literature. What it's trying to do is figure out a way, a principled way, to go look through your data, sort it to make sense. Now, of course, the question is, how do you sort this in making sense? It seems to require expert-in-the-loop knowledge. But what your computer can do is look at the variables you have, take cuts along one of the variables, and see, in fact, if there's a good way to make this decision process happen. So what I want to illustrate this with is a specific example, which is called looking at what's called the iris data. And what the iris data is this is one of the earliest examples. Ooh, all right, so I'm going to glide out there for a minute. But the iris data is fantastic data. It's looking at 3 types of irises and trying to classify between the 3 of them. Okay? And the classification task is to try to figure out, is there a way you can look at, for instance, the petal width of an iris and the petal length of an iris and systematically find classifiers between the 3 types of irises. Okay, that's going to be the goal for us once I get this clean. So the board cleaning is a little hard on this thing. All right. And now we switch to MATLAB. Okay, and I'm going to load up these iris data for us to look at. Okay, so it is built into MATLAB, the iris data. It's typically used for doing some data analysis, and it's called, as you might expect, well, actually iris is in the name, but it's called load Fisher iris. Okay, so typically this was sort of for Fisher information or Fisher discriminants. So Fisher iris is a preloaded set of data, and we're going to take a look at it here. In particular, we're going to load this up, And we're going to use this gscatter command to look at the data. So the way this works, we're going to say gscatter. It's going to make a scatter plot. So once you load this in, this first column of this matrix, MEAS, is the petal width. Second column, I think, is the petal length and then petal width. These are the two parameters that we're going to be looking at. And we're going to plot this against the species. It's going to be coming as labeled data, and the labels are going to be in that species vector. First one is I'll just plot this here, X label, and these aren't, so sepal length, and Y label is sepal width. If you're a real biologist, you'll know what the word sepal means, which I would say is like a leaf type or the flower structure. I think that's what it is. So, all right, so let's go ahead and take a look at this thing when I plot it. All right, so here it is. Here is your data, and let's talk this through. I should probably set a line width be thicker, but basically what there are in this data set are three types of irises, okay? And this is the width, and that's the length, and then the red is one type of iris. This is how, like if you took measurements from these things, this is where they scatter up here. Here's the green, and here's the blue. And so what you would like to do is build a decision tree based upon this data and try to figure out how to do a classify and a regression. In other words, I want to paint this space up in a way that makes sense, that gives me the best classification possible. Okay? Now, here's the idea behind the decision tree. It's a principled way to start looking at variables, and in particular, start looking at variables, for instance, in one direction, and start asking the following questions. So this will be a very expensive step, which is it's going to take on all the values between the minimum and the maximum. Let's take this variable here. And it's going to look from here to there. It's going to take on these values of variables. It's going to say, look, if I take this point and I look at values on either side of it, how well can I discriminate? How well does it separate the rest of the data? Okay? And I can actually do a metric with this. So I can say, what about this point? How about this point? How well does it allow me to separate the data? What about the next point and the next point? And so what it's trying to do is figure out, how do I cut this data? Either this way or this way, so that I get maximal separation. So I could look at this variable and ask, how well do I do a separation? And I know I can evaluate how well does it do a separation because I know what the data, this is my training data. Okay, so I can get I have a truth table. So remember, this is supervised learning. I can also go this way and cut this way and look at every variable position. Let's say for the greens, what if I take this value to this value and I draw lines this way? How well does it separate the data? This is expensive because I have to do a lot of values this way, a lot of values that way. But it is a finite operation. If you look at the number of points here, you know, okay, so maybe if I have 50 points in each thing, I'm trying 50 values this way, 50 this way, 50 this way. That's not that much really, right? I mean, it's 150 things I have to try and evaluate how well the separation happens. So it's big, but finite. A lot of these kind of classification problems, you have to be careful of getting into a situation where you have what's called an NP-hard problem. This is not NP-hard at all. It is just simply, it can be cumbersome, but finite. And that is the real win in doing the separation process. Okay? So let me show you how the algorithm works. And I want to plot this thing, so I'm going to start setting it up so that we can do the visualization. So first I want to plot this whole region in here. And so what I want to do is define some variables, x and y, on a mesh grid. And I want to color all the points depending upon what they would be regions of their classification. So let me go in steps of 0.1 to 8 and 2.1 to 4.5. Okay, there's my mesh grid. So from values of 4 to 8 in one direction, steps of 0.1, values of 2 to 4.5 and steps of 0.1 in the other direction. And I picked these values based upon what the measurements were of the actual iris data. Okay? So make up 2 new variables. Okay, and then I'm going to basically classify these. Actually, okay, sorry. So there we go. So that's my X and Y. This is my regions I want to look at. And now I'm ready to do build a decision tree. Okay, so decision tree, there's some nice built-in MATLAB commands that make this very easy to do. Once I have my data, my iris data, and I showed you what that was, and I'm using the first 2 columns of the iris data, which have to do with sepal width and sepal length. Those are the 2 variables I'm going to look at, and I have 3 data sets in there. I have 3 types of irises. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is separate those 3 types of irises as best I can in this 2-dimensional parameter space. So it's a little bit of a contrived example, but it will illustrate the point very nicely. Okay? And then I'm going to plot the results on a grid that is mesh gridded like this. All right, so first I want to build a decision tree, or a tree that fits the data. And, not surprisingly, to build that tree, I can use the tree fit command. That's it. So tree fit, and I bring in the data that I'm going to try to fit it to. The first 2 columns of the data. Oops. I take those first 2 columns of data, that's what I plotted against each other before, and they're classified with the species command. By the way, I can show you what species looks like. So species here, it's basically a label. So if I look at the label, this is all in the iris data. So one of them is Virginica, versicolor, setosa. These are the 3 types of irises I'm trying to classify. So you see what I've actually done here. This is my label, right? I've labeled the data just like I did with support vector machine, just like I did with KNN search, just like I did with any of the supervised learning algorithms. With the supervised learning, you give it labels. I gave it labels, and I give it, look at these 2 parameters of these things and do a tree fit, okay? And this tree fit is going to cut through the variables and look at the optimal way to separate the data. And once it makes that data, it says, oh, look, right here, for instance, if X is bigger than 4, I can ask the question, is X bigger than 4? And maybe that gives me a great separation, so I take that as a line. Now I take the rest of the data and I start building the tree. Now what I do is another slice this way is Y bigger than 3? And I do a separation this way. So you continue that tree structure like I drew until you cut everything down and you get a nice separation between everything, or the best separation you can. All right. Now let's pull in this thing, tree. Now I want to basically tree evaluate. Evaluate the tree for this data. Okay, so now, here, this is the best tree fit, and now I'm evaluating the overall tree using the objective, the functional output of this tree fit command along with my data. Okay, and it's going to give me a bunch of parameters here. It's going to tell me the class and the nodes and the number here. Okay. There are different ways to actually evaluate this thing. I can actually basically look at here. Let me show you some nice visualization tricks. I'm not going to go too much into detail here. This will be in the notes. Okay. I can evaluate. Okay, so here's what I'm doing here. In the top one, I actually went and evaluated where all those points sat. Okay, so what's going to happen is I had them labeled, right? But then I can actually go, well, if I label them that way, let me come back and actually ask what class they came into. Okay, here on this tree val here, this command is a little bit nicer because what I'm going to actually do with this thing, let me show you. So I'm going to take here, the node, the group name it's going to belong to. These are going to be a bunch of variables I get out. I'm going to evaluate the tree at every point in x and y. In other words, remember x and y were? X and y was this grid I defined. So I'm going to define at every point where would it belong in the tree architecture. In other words, I've done a classification and a cut down. I've built this tree from the data. And now what I want to ask is, in this space, where does every point belong to? Okay, so I can do the tree evaluation on that tree data at every point. Okay? And when I do this, the best thing to do is just do a g-scatter plot. That data comes back. And it's going to come back as green, red, and blue. And okay. So I'm going to take and now plot at every point what it came back as. What is the group name it got associated with? Okay, so in other words, I built a tree with some training data, and now I can fill in the entire space, classification space, using this command. I'm not sure why it's not coming out here. Okay, and by the way, it says GRB there. All right, so let's run this thing. Okay. Uh-oh. Might be complaining. Uh-oh. Bound. I see. It probably is up here. Oh, I see. Okay. I think I have an extra parentheses there. Oh yeah, this shouldn't be there. That's why it was still complaining. Okay, there we go. All right. So I'm going to run this thing. Now it's going to pop this figure here. Okay, and this is the big figure that you get from this decision tree. Very simple example. And what it's done with that data is it looked instead at looking at your clusters, with those clusters or the training data you gave it, it now can basically fill out the entire space. And I defined this thing to go from 4 to 8 in steps of 0.1 and from 2 to 4.5 in steps of 0.1. And notice what it does. Here is all the red. Look at the blue. Look at the green regions. Now, first of all, look at how it cut up space. It did it in a way that these are clearly, look at this. Look at these structures here, right? These are not lines that you're just simply drawing through things. These are not even a curved surface. This is like breaking up the entire domain into some structured space which best classifies the data, okay? So if you have complex data, this decision process just simply takes everything and cuts it down in this decision tree way. So now, if you give me a new point of data, I can project it onto here, and I can ask, is it red, blue, or green? And this gives you one of the most rich set of classification space possible. Look at it. It's pretty amazing. Very important, again, that you cross-validate if you have data. Okay? Always cross-validate if you can. All right? But decision trees have proven to be one of the most successful ways to do supervised learning and classification of data from high-dimensional space. Okay? It is extremely successful, and in fact, support vector machine and classification trees, if you can beat those, you'll have a great method. But those are sort of the workhorse of the industry because they just simply are easy to implement and they do an amazing job doing classification. Now, one of the other interesting things too about classification trees is that you can actually visualize what the tree looks like. So there's a command here, tree disp, tree display. It will actually show you what the tree looks like. So I'm going to pop it up here. Oop. Okay, and tree display will actually construct for you the view of the tree. And there it is. This is how it systematically went through and started making decisions. So you start off here, and notice what it did. It said, hey, look, if the septal length is less than 5.45, come here. So in other words, this decision was the first one made. It said the septal length at 5.45 was really important. We're going to make a classification cut right at that level. Okay? And by the way, where does that correspond to? Well, that first cut was right here. See this right here? Where the red is right here? This is this way. It would have been a cut right along here. So that was the first cut it took. But it keeps cutting. So over here, it makes another decision and breaks it down. Here it makes a decision, keeps breaking this decision. And so you see the decision tree, you see the branches and the leaves. And there's an algorithm that tells it when to stop. So after you've done this split here, it turns out it evaluates and says, look, you're not getting much information or you're not getting good separation from any more cuts along this direction. So stop there, build out the rest of the tree. So it's a nice architecture to view the decision-making process. And so right now you can say take data, a new piece of data, and just simply go through this and say, these are all if statements, okay? And the if statements allow you to come down this tree. So you can say, is this true or not? Go this way or this way. Is this true or not? Go this way or this way. And then you find yourself eventually on some leaf, and that's where you got classified, okay? So this is the decision tree. Of course, we didn't go into it in too much detail, but now you have access to a code and hopefully some of the critical ideas, which is just simply looking across data. Remember, it's kind of an intensive search, right? You're taking one variable and sweeping across all possible values and asking, does it classify well here or there? And the one that classifies the best, that's where you make your first cut. Then you go to the next level and you classify with that. You make a second cut, a third cut, and you keep going. But the important thing is not NP hard. NP hard problems you just can't solve. This is not NP hard. It's intensive, but it's finite number of computations.